In the winter of 1996, a respiratory epidemic swept through the dairy farms of Grant County, Wisconsin. Herd after herd collapsed, 12, 15, 18% of animals gone in a single season. Veterinarians arrived with syringes and invoices. Engineers showed up with electric fans and blueprints. The county spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to stop it. And then there was Ruth Halverson. 68 years old, 240 cows, and not one single death. The vet sent to investigate walked into her barn and stopped. The air was different, the light was different, and on her kitchen shelf sat a book published in the 1800s, with handwritten notes in the margins from a woman named Elsa. What Elsa wrote no one had bothered to read for over a century, until now. Light has been killing bacteria for longer than bacteria have known what light is. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical fact that predates germ theory, predates Louis Pasteur, predates the entire edifice of modern microbiology by several thousand years of observable, repeatable human experience. Sunlight striking a contaminated surface destroys the microorganisms on it through a combination of ultraviolet radiation, which damages bacterial DNA, and desiccation, which removes the moisture that bacteria require to survive and replicate. The mechanism was not understood until the late 19th century, but the effect had been noticed and acted upon by farmers, healers, and builders across the Mediterranean, across Central Europe, across every agricultural civilization that had ever observed the difference between animals kept in dark, damp enclosures and animals kept in light, dry ones. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between herds that died of respiratory disease every winter and herds that did not. Elsa Halverson had noticed this difference in Bavaria in 1871, which was the year she married a farmer named Klaus, inherited his failing dairy operation, and decided, over the protests of everyone who had an opinion about the matter, to rebuild his barn facing south, with a roofline designed to admit winter sunlight to the floor of every stall, from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Klaus thought this was impractical. The neighbors thought it was eccentric. A German agricultural publication of the era Lehrbuch der Landwirtschaft, a compendium of practical farming methods that had been compiled by a Bavarian agricultural association, and that Klaus kept on the shelf above his desk, contained a brief section on barn orientation that noted, without much elaboration, that south-facing barns with appropriately angled roof extensions had been observed in certain alpine districts to produce lower rates of respiratory illness in winter-housed cattle, and that the probable mechanism was the bactericidal effect of direct solar radiation on the floor litter. Elsa read that section. She rebuilt the barn. The cattle stopped dying in February. She wrote the method into the margins of her copy of the Lehrbuch in her careful Bavarian hand, with specific dimensions and angles, and the particular roofline profile that she had worked out over 2 building seasons by observation, noting which roof angle admitted sunlight at what time of day during the shortest days of December, adjusting the overhang until the light reached the floor of every stall for the required 6 hours. That book, with her marginal notes still legible in brown ink that had faded but not disappeared, traveled from Bavaria to Wisconsin in the trunk of her grandson Heinrich Halverson in 1903, when Heinrich immigrated to Grant County and purchased 160 acres of rolling dairy country along the Platte River. He built his first barn in 1905 using Elsa's dimensions and Elsa's roofline, checked against the marginalia in the Lehrbuch, with the care of a man who trusted his grandmother's observations more than his own instincts, because his grandmother had done the experiment and he had not. His daughter Marta farmed the same ground from 1941 to 1979. She built a second barn in 1962, using the same orientation, the same roofline angle, the same stall dimensions, updating the materials from rough-cut oak to commercial lumber, but preserving the geometric relationships that governed light penetration. She kept the Lehrbuch on the kitchen shelf, Elsa's notes still visible in the margins. consulted occasionally when a building question arose that the available expertise around her could not resolve to her satisfaction. Ruth Halverson was 68 years old in the winter of 1996, and she had been farming the same ground for 31 years, since her mother Marta had handed her the operation in 1965 with the Lehrbuch and the words, "The cows have to see the sun every day." Elsa figured that out in 1871, and nothing has changed since. The 2 barns that Ruth maintained on the Halverson farm were built according to Elsa's specifications, updated and extended by 3 generations of careful observation. The main dairy barn, rebuilt in 1978 after the original 1905 structure had aged past safe use, faced due south with a roof overhang on the south side, calculated to admit direct sunlight to the floor of every stall from approximately 10:15 a.m. to 4:00 p.m. on December 21st, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year and the design day for maximum solar penetration. The north wall was solid, windowless, heavily insulated, a thermal mass that absorbed the cold of Wisconsin nights and released it slowly, preventing the rapid temperature drops that promoted respiratory stress in cattle. The south wall was a combination of fixed windows at stall height and hinged ventilation panels above them, designed to be adjusted seasonally open in summer for maximum airflow, partially closed in winter to retain heat while maintaining the air exchange rate that prevented moisture accumulation. The second barn, used for young stock and dry cows, followed the same orientation and roofline geometry at smaller scale. Ruth did not think of this design as unusual. She had grown up with it, had watched the sunlight move across the barn floor every winter morning, had cleaned the stall bedding with the particular attention that the design required. The litter in the sunlit zones replaced more frequently because the UV exposure dried it faster, and the bacterial load was demonstrably lower, which she knew not from measurement but from smell, and from the absence of the ammonia buildup that characterized the poorly managed barns she had visited in the county over the decades. She thought of it the way she thought of the Lehrbuch on the kitchen shelf, as a document of what had been observed and found to work, requiring no justification beyond the fact that it continued to work. Dr. Kevin Marsh drove into Grant County in the 3rd week of January 1996, 3 days after the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory in Madison had issued an advisory on an emerging respiratory disease outbreak in dairy herds across the southwestern Wisconsin counties. He was 41 years old, a clinical veterinarian with a specialty in dairy cattle health from the University of Wisconsin College of Veterinary Medicine, and he had been doing outbreak assessments across southwestern Wisconsin for 11 years. He was thorough, methodical, and genuinely concerned about the animals in the farms he visited. Not a paper veterinarian, but a field veterinarian, the kind who arrived in mud boots and left in mud boots, and sometimes missed dinner because a case had been more complicated than expected. The outbreak was Mannheimia hemolytica, the bacterial pathogen most frequently associated with bovine respiratory disease complex, or BRD, the syndrome that the cattle industry called shipping fever in feedlots and winter pneumonia in dairy operations. Hemolytica was a commensal organism, normally resident in the upper respiratory tracts of healthy cattle without causing disease. Under stress conditions, temperature fluctuations, overcrowding, poor ventilation, concurrent viral infections, it migrated from the nasopharynx into the lung, where it produced a leukotoxin that destroyed the bovine immune cells attempting to contain it, leading to rapid fibrinous pneumonia that killed untreated animals within 3 to 5 days of clinical onset. The 1995-96 winter in Grant County had provided ideal conditions for the outbreak. A December warm spell followed by a sharp January cold snap had created precisely the temperature cycling that stressed bovine respiratory immunity. The wet December had left barn litter saturated and bacterial loads elevated. The cold snap had closed ventilation systems that farmers had left open during the warm spell, trapping moisture and exhaled pathogens inside barn spaces that had lost their summer exchange rate without gaining adequate winter heating. By the third week of January, Marsh was documenting herd losses averaging 12% across the affected farms in Grant County, 1 in 8 animals dead or culled from disease in a single winter month. On the worst affected operations, the loss rate was approaching 18%. The economic damage per farm ranged from $24,000 to $67,000, depending on herd size and milk production value. He pulled his truck into the Halverson farm on a Tuesday morning and found Ruth in the main barn doing her morning check. The barn was warm, dry, and quiet. The sunlight was coming through the south windows at a low winter angle, laying broad bands of light across the floor of the center aisle and the forward portions of the stalls on the south side. The ammonia level that Marsh's nose registered as a working metric of barn air quality, not from any instrument, but from 12 years of walking into problem barns and healthy barns and learning to read the gradient, was low, noticeably, unusually low. He looked at the cattle, 240 Holstein Friesian cows, all visually assessed in 90 seconds as alert, standing correctly, breathing without the labored abdominal effort that characterized respiratory compromise. He turned to Ruth. "How many animals have you lost this winter?" "None," she said. Marsh looked at his clipboard, then back at the barn. "None? Not from pneumonia. I lost 1 heifer in November, hardware disease. Not respiratory. No pneumonia deaths. No treatments. Not 1 animal showing clinical signs." He walked the length of the barn slowly, looking at the animals, looking at the ventilation panels, looking at the sunlight bands on the floor, looking at the roof angle through the south windows. "Your barn faces south," he said. "Yes, specifically south, or generally southish?" Ruth looked at him with the particular expression of a woman whose grandmother had spent 2 building seasons calculating the exact roof angle for maximum winter solstice penetration. "Specifically south," she said. "Due south, 2 degrees east. The overhang is cut at 19 degrees to the horizontal. The floor of every stall gets direct sun from 10:15 to 4 in the afternoon on the shortest day of the year." Marsh wrote that down. "Who designed it?" "My great-grandmother. In Bavaria. In 1871. He stopped writing and looked up. "She rebuilt the barn after her husband's cattle kept dying in February," Ruth said. "She read about sun orientation in a German farming book and figured out the right roof angle by watching where the light fell at different times of day in December. She wrote the dimensions in the margins of the book." She paused. "I still have the book." Marsh spent 4 hours at the Halverson farm that day. Ruth showed him the layer book, the pages yellow at the edges, the brown ink of Elsa's marginalia still fully legible, the dimensional annotations, and the small pencil sketch of the roofline profile, with its 19-degree overhang angle, annotated in centimeters. He photographed every page of the relevant section. He also collected air quality data with the monitoring equipment he carried in his truck: particulate matter, ammonia concentration, carbon dioxide, relative humidity, and took environmental swab samples from the stall floors, in both the sunlit zones and the zones that received no direct light, in the barn corners farthest from the south windows. He collected equivalent samples from 3 outbreak-affected barns in the same county before driving back to Madison. The laboratory results took a week. When they came back, Marsh sat with them for a long time before calling the farm. The ammonia concentration in the Halverson barn was 4.2 parts per million below the threshold of 10 parts per million, at which bovine respiratory epithelium begins to show compromise. The 3 outbreak barns averaged 23.7 parts per million. The relative humidity in the Halverson barn was 62% within the optimal range for bovine respiratory health. The outbreak barns averaged 81%. The environmental swabs told the most specific story. The stall floor samples from the sunlit zones of the Halverson barn showed M. hemolytica colony counts of 200 to 400 colony-forming units per square centimeter. The samples from the non-sunlit corners of the same barn, the areas behind the stalls that the winter sun did not reach, showed counts of 1,800 to 2,400 CFU per square centimeter. The 3 outbreak barns showed floor counts ranging from 8,400 to 14,700 CFU per square centimeter. The sunlit zones of Ruth's barn had bacterial loads 1/30th to 1/40th of the levels in the outbreak barns. The mechanism was direct solar UV radiation, specifically UVB, in the 280 to 315 nanometer range, which penetrated window glass and caused thymine dimer formation in bacterial DNA, preventing replication. M. hemolytica, like most gram-negative bacteria, had moderate UV sensitivity. A 90% reduction in viability occurred after approximately 45 minutes of direct solar exposure at winter sun angles in Wisconsin's latitude. 6 hours of daily exposure in the sunlit stall zones effectively prevented bacterial accumulation in the floor litter to levels capable of sustaining an infectious dose. Elsa Halverson had understood this in 1871 without knowing the mechanism. She had observed the outcome cattle that lived through February instead of dying in it, and had built the physical system that produced the outcome. The mechanism had been characterized by photobiology researchers in the 1930s and 1940s. The specific application to barn pathogen management had been discussed in a handful of agricultural engineering papers in the 1950s, and then largely forgotten as the industry moved toward electric ventilation systems, controlled environment housing, and antibiotic prophylaxis as the primary tools of respiratory disease management. Ruth had never read those papers. She had read Elsa's marginalia. Marsh drove back to the Halverson farm in the second week of February, after the outbreak had run its course through the county. He brought a colleague from the veterinary school, Dr. Sandra Hofmeister, a researcher in bovine respiratory disease epidemiology who had been studying the environmental determinants of BRD incidence for 6 years and who had read the preliminary data from the Halverson barn samples with what she later described as the expression of someone who has just found a $20 bill in an old coat pocket. Ruth made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table with the Lehrbuch between them and the swab data between them and a topographic map of Grant County between them, and they talked for 3 hours. Hofmeister asked Ruth to describe, as precisely as possible, what she had observed over 31 years of farming the Halverson operation with respect to respiratory disease. Ruth described it methodically, the way a woman describes 31 years of daily observation, not dramatically, not with any particular sense of vindication, but with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has been paying attention for a long time to a system that works, and who has been paying attention closely enough to know why. She had never had a winter in which more than 2 animals showed clinical respiratory signs. In 31 years, with a herd of 240 cows. In a county where the average annual BRD mortality in dairy herds was between 3 and 8% per year, she had never administered prophylactic antibiotics for respiratory disease. She had treated 2 individual animals with antibiotics in 31 years for confirmed bacterial pneumonia, both cases presenting in autumn before the barn was closed for winter, when the UV exposure hours were still adequate but the temperature stress of the transition season had compromised individual animals. Both had recovered. Her total expenditure on respiratory disease management, veterinary visits, antibiotics, diagnostic fees over 31 years of farming 240 cows averaged approximately $340 per year. The county average for operations of comparable size was $8,400 per year. She had not thought of this as remarkable. She had thought of it as what happened when you built the barn the way Elsa had described. Hofmeister looked at the numbers for a long moment. "What do your neighbors think about the barn?" "Most of them think it's old-fashioned," Ruth said. One neighbor, Dale Sorensen, about 2 miles west, his grandfather built a south-facing barn in 1920. He still has it. He told me once that his grandfather had read about it somewhere. She paused. I told him the same thing came from Bavaria in a trunk in 1903. How many animals did Dale lose this winter? None, Ruth said. He called to tell me. He thought it was funny, in a way that wasn't entirely funny. Hofmeister wrote Dale Sorensen's name in her notebook. She wrote it underlined. The research paper that Marsh and Hofmeister published in the Journal of Dairy Science in September 1997 was titled Passive Solar Barn Design and Bovine Respiratory Disease Incidence, Environmental Microbiology and Epidemiological Analysis of Two Contrasting Management Systems in Grant County, Wisconsin. It was 14 pages long and documented the environmental data from the Halverson barn, the 3 outbreak barns, the Sorensen farm, and 4 additional farms that Hofmeister had identified by county agricultural records as having south-facing barns built before 1930. Barns whose builders had likely had access to the same pre-antibiotic era, German and Scandinavian agricultural literature, that had informed Elsa Halverson's design. Of the 6 south-facing pre-1930 barns in the study, none had experienced significant BRD losses in the 1995-96 outbreak. The average BRD mortality across all 6 farms for the outbreak winter was 0.3% less than 1 animal per 100. The county average for the same winter was 12.4%. The paper's principal finding was stated in the abstract. Direct solar radiation exposure of barn floor litter for a minimum of 6 hours per day during winter months, achieved through passive architectural design rather than artificial UV supplementation, reduces Mannheimia haemolytica environmental load in the bovine respiratory disease complex pathozone to levels below those associated with outbreak-level infection pressure. The bactericidal mechanism is consistent with established UVB photobiology. The design principle, derived from 19th-century Central European agricultural practice, achieves microbial reduction outcomes equivalent to active environmental disinfection protocols at zero marginal operating cost. The paper received enough attention in the veterinary literature that Marsh was invited to present the findings at the 1998 American Association of Bovine Practitioners Annual Conference in Omaha. He brought the Lehrbuch. He showed the conference, on a slide projected to a screen in a hotel ballroom in Nebraska, the pencil sketch of a roofline angle that a Bavarian farmer's wife had drawn in the margins of an agricultural textbook in 1871, and that had prevented, across 4 generations and 125 years of Wisconsin winters, the deaths of hundreds of dairy cows from a disease that the conference was spending 3 days discussing how to prevent. There was a silence in the ballroom after he showed the slide. "I want to be clear about what I'm saying," Marsh told the conference. "I'm not saying this replaces vaccination. I'm not saying this replaces appropriate antibiotic therapy for clinically ill animals. I'm saying that an architectural decision, a roofline angle, a compass bearing, a window placement made by a woman in Bavaria in 1871, has been providing passive microbial control in this barn for 125 years. No electricity, no consumables, no maintenance beyond what the structure itself requires. And the woman who made that decision did not have access to UV photobiology research. She had access to observation. She watched what happened to cattle in barns that faced south and in barns that didn't, and she built accordingly." He paused. "The question I keep asking myself is, how many other Elsas are there? How many design principles exist in old barns, in old books, in old marginalia, that we stopped paying attention to when we got access to antibiotics and electric fans? And how many animals are dying preventably because we forgot to ask?" Nobody in the ballroom had an answer, but several people wrote down the question. Dr. Hofmeister brought the passive solar barn design research to the University of Wisconsin's School of Veterinary Medicine Curriculum Committee in the spring of 1998 proposing the incorporation of a module on environmental design principles in BRD prevention into the second-year dairy health management course. The proposal met with some resistance. The course was already full. The topic was peripheral to clinical veterinary training, and several faculty members were skeptical of what one committee member described as retrofitting pre-scientific agricultural practices into an evidence-based curriculum. Hofmeister pointed out, with the patience of someone who had spent 2 years collecting the evidence, that the practice was now evidence-based. The resistance diminished. The module was incorporated into the dairy health management course, beginning in the fall semester of 1999 under the title Passive Environmental Design in Bovine Respiratory Health, Historical Principles and Contemporary Application. It covered the UV photobiology of M. hemolytica inactivation, the epidemiological data from the Grant County study, the principles of south-facing barn orientation and roofline design for winter solar penetration, and the cost-benefit analysis comparing passive solar management with active ventilation and prophylactic antibiotic protocols. The module's opening slide showed 2 images side by side. A photograph of the Halverson barn in January, sunlight streaming through the south windows across the stall floor, and a photograph of a 1996 outbreak barn in the same county, dark and humid and smelling of ammonia. Beneath the photographs was a caption that Hofmeister had written and that Marsh had approved, and that both of them felt represented the lesson accurately. Left. Grant County, Wisconsin, January 1996. 240 cows. 0 BRD deaths. Right. Same county, same month. 189 cows. 23 BRD deaths. The difference is not genetics, not management, not feed. The difference is a roof angle. The design on the left was specified by a woman in Bavaria in 1871. The one on the right was built in 1988. Ruth Halverson received a copy of the curriculum module in the mail from Hofmeister in the fall of 1999. She read it at the kitchen table with the Lehrbuch open to Elsa's marginalia beside it, comparing the photobiology data in the module's technical section against the pencil sketch of the roofline profile. The 19-degree overhang angle in the sketch corresponded, as Hofmeister had calculated in the paper, to the optimal angle for admitting December solstice sunlight to the floor of a stall in the latitude band of 42 to 44 degrees north, which included both the Bavarian highlands and Grant County, Wisconsin. Elsa had not known the latitude calculation. She had worked it out with a measuring stick and the December sun and her own eyes, watching where the light fell on the floor at different hours of the shortest day of the year. The answer was the same. Ruth closed the Lehrbuch and looked out the window at the main barn, its south face bright in the afternoon sun, the light coming through the windows at the angle Elsa had specified in 1871, and that Ruth had maintained through 3 buildings and 31 Wisconsin winters. She thought about the calendar. It was October. In 2 months, the December sun would be at its lowest angle, and the light would be doing what it had been doing every December since Heinrich had built the first Wisconsin barn to Elsa's dimensions in 1905. Moving slowly across the floor of the stalls, reaching the dark corners where the bacteria preferred to live, eliminating the invisible threat that the antibiotic era had made people forget was a threat at all. She thought about Elsa, a woman she had never met, dead for decades before Ruth was born, who had rebuilt a failing barn in Bavaria and written the dimensions in a book's margins because she had noticed something and wanted to make sure someone else would notice it too. Ansang matroi la baxi tu irenut va totnut, her mother had said not in German, but Ruth knew what it meant and where it came from. She went out to do the evening check. By 2024, the Passive Solar Barn Design Module at the University of Wisconsin School of Veterinary Medicine had been in continuous use for 25 years. It had been updated 3 times to incorporate new photobiology research and updated BRD epidemiology data. But the core content had not changed. South orientation, 19-degree overhang at Wisconsin latitudes, 6 hours of winter floor sunlight, zero-cost passive microbial management. Ruth Halverson retired from active farming in 2018 at the age of 90, handing the operation to her daughter Carol, who had grown up in the barn and had never in her adult life seen a BRD outbreak affect her family's herd. Carol maintained both barns to the same design standards. She had read the Lehrbuch. She had read Hofmeister's paper. She kept them on the same kitchen shelf. The main barn, rebuilt in 1978 to Elsa's specifications for the 3rd time, using modern materials but identical geometry, was 46 years old in 2024 and structurally sound. The south-facing windows admitted the winter sun at 10:17 a.m. on December 21, 2023, within 2 minutes of the design specification that Elsa Halverson had worked out in Bavaria in 1871 with a measuring stick and the patience to observe what the sun did when you pointed a barn directly at it. Dr. Kevin Marsh retired from veterinary practice in 2015. In his retirement remarks to his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin College of Veterinary Medicine, he said one thing that was remembered clearly enough to be quoted back to him afterward by 3 different people. In 30 years of bovine veterinary practice, the most effective disease prevention system I ever documented was built in 1871 by a woman who had no formal training in microbiology, no understanding of UV photobiology, no access to antibiotic therapy, and no laboratory diagnostic capability. She had a sick herd, a German farming book, and the patience to watch where the sun fell on the floor in December. Everything I know about passive environmental management in cattle health traces back to that barn. I hope we never stop being students of the barns that old farmers built before we knew how to explain why they worked. The Lehrbuch, with Elsa's brown ink marginalia still legible after 153 years, remained on the kitchen shelf of the Halverson farmhouse in Grant County, Wisconsin. Carol consulted it occasionally when a building question arose that the available expertise around her could not resolve to her satisfaction. Some questions, it turned out, had already been answered. You just had to know where to look.